Well, good afternoon, everyone. And so Rob Beeman dragged me in to teach you guys a bit about what the shark stuff we're doing out in the Coral Sea. I actually did my undergrad with Rob Beeman, so the relationship there goes back a long time. So Rob and myself are both in the JCU campus in Cairns, whereas the Townsville one's the bigger one. There's only a few marine people up here, but if you've ever been to Townsville, that's why we live in Cairns. So just the shark research, I'm just going to go through the stuff we've been doing out in the Coral Sea in the various spots there for the last 20 odd years or so, and also to show some of the active tracks we have of some sharks at the moment, because obviously sharks are a big issue in Australia and gets very topical at certain periods of time. We're actually conducting research in the Whitsundays at the moment as a result of the couple of attacks we had a few years ago, and which has been interesting biologically because that whole area had never had shark research done in it ever. So it has actually filled in a bit of a black hole for us, what's happening down there. But yeah, I'm at JCU and also at Biopixel. So Biopixel is a natural history filming company. So we do heaps of filming for Discovery, BBC, Nat Geo. We actually use a lot of the funding from the documentaries to fund the shark research. So while we're out on location, we'll be concurrently running research programs whilst filming. And this is one of the tiger sharks we're working with up in the Coral Sea. And you can see our highly protective shark board shorts that we wear when filming tiger sharks feeding. I'll talk a bit about tigers a bit later on. In terms of the Coral Sea, the species we first worked on were the reef sharks up in the shallows. And the location we did most of this work at was Osprey Reef, which you guys have been past. And so as you would know, it's way out there and has very deep walls. And the thing about Osprey Reef and the Coral Sea reefs of Australia, which are in our economic zone, they've had very little historic fishing pressure. So when you jump in the water out there, what you see is kind of what the Great Barrier Reef would have been like 40 or 50 years ago before we did have fishing pressure on sharks. So back in the day, we started out just doing the basic biology, growth rates, home range, seasonal movement patterns. Osprey Reef is visited a few times a week by tourist operators when the tourist operations are running, not like at the moment with COVID. And there is shark attracting and shark feeding that happens out there. So we wanted to look at, just if there was negative effects on the animals and exactly what was happening as part of that. Because there is tourism out there, there was a lot of money spent by people to get out there. So when we started the program, we wanted to do research that was benign as possible to the sharks, in that we weren't hooking them, and causing mouth damage and stuff like that, because we could have got negative reactions from tourists as a result. I have a big background in captive shark biology, working at a number of public aquariums around the world. So the kind of techniques we use for sharks in captivity, we applied kind of for the first time with sharks in the wild, which is mainly using tail ropes and wrestling the sharks to catch them, and then to do the tagging. So out at Osprey, we'd put a box of food down. We weren't feeding the sharks, we were using the smell to attract the sharks in, particularly in this case, the white-tip reef sharks. And they all have unique markings, so you could tell individuals, and we aim to get them up on the boat at least once a year. And so you could just sit there and wait for the very shark you wanted, and then just swim up behind it, slip a tail rope around its tail rope it, and then hang on. So pretty straightforward and easy, really. Kind of looked like this. This is from an old Discovery Channel show. So yeah, so that's the kind of thing. So you could tell the individuals if the females are pregnant, we obviously wouldn't grab them and things like that. And then with the white tips, like a lot of the reef sharks, they go into tonic immobility, and particularly the white tips. Once you've got them tail roped, if you squeeze the tip of the tail really hard, they just shut down. Was it dangerous? Not really, because keep away from the pointy end. The juveniles, the small ones, are feistier than the big females and the adults out there. And a lot of the big ones, because they've been caught so many times, when you grab them, they just relax straight away. It wasn't overly stressful. We used to, in the early days, follow the sharks back to see, what would happen. And often they'd go straight back to the crate. And in fact, when we were doing one Discovery Channel show, the presenter caught the same shark 8 times in one day. So yeah, it's a low stress thing for the sharks, not necessarily low stress for the researchers. But then we could bring the animals up and do our measurements, and then they'd be tagged with a microchip, but also have a radio transmitter surgically implanted inside their body cavity. So then we could track their movements 24/7. So at this stage, when we started this, we had no idea of the home range of the different species out on these oceanic reefs. I'll skip that one. So what we did do is put an array of MCO receivers around Osprey Reef. And these are all the locations you can see on the graph. So the size of the circle, and we had them out there for over 18 months. So the size of the circles gives a percentage time that the sharks spend in the different locations. But the interesting thing here is that when you look at it, most of the animals are spending their time in the northwest quadrant, which is obviously the most protected from the prevailing southeast winds. Also, that's where the divers are, the dive boats, all the food sources, big schools of fish hang in that area as well. With it, we found that we tag grey reefs, white tips, mantas, and silver tips. With the white tip population, there was one group would be around the North Horn, the northernmost part, and then down on the western flanks where you see the larger circles is the entrance, and so they'd hang there as well. So there was one subgroup living at the entrance and one subgroup living at North Horn, and the females didn't intermingle much. It was basically the males would move between the two. With the grey reefs and silver tips, they were moving from the entrance to North Horn. The silver tips were coming in at both locations and then spending time out in deeper water and further away from the reef and outside of the listening areas. But at the entrance and North Horn, you have a number of cleaning stations. And so you do regularly see the animals coming in to get clean there, including the manta rays. The interesting thing there with the yellow, which is the manta rays, the MR, is that the mantas were going into Osprey at night time and hanging out there. And so what we think they were feeding on euphorsids and things like that coming out of the substrate in that shallow Osprey lagoon. And the small dots around the whole reef that the sharks hardly went in many of those other locations. Is that northwest quadrant is really a hot spot for these animals. And indeed, using this as a model, when you visit the other coral sea reefs, if you go diving, you do see a predominance of the large pelagic animals living in that northwest quadrant. So why was all that important? So the Coral Sea Marine Park came into effect just a few years ago, but during the development of the Coral Sea Marine Park, a lot of the initial plans had all the western side of the coral reef still available for recreational and commercial fishing. And so using the data, we were able to show that the western side, that particularly that northwestern quadrant, was probably, in terms of sharks, the most significant areas to get protected. So the plan went through many iterations to basically appease everyone, but we were able to get those western sides protected on the majority of the reefs. There were some really weird ideas. At one stage, they were going to have a protection zone that was only going to be like 30 meters wide down the western zone, and it's just impossible to police. But in the end, the conservation groups were really pushing to maximize the amount of green zone, the fully protected areas, But as we were telling the green groups, you know, where you put your green is really important. It's not just a percentage gain. You really have to be planning out where it went. So yeah, we were pretty happy that the research went a long way in helping develop, you know, the current Marine Park Reserve, which is the Coral Sea Marine Park connected to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, is the second largest, you know, connected protected area in the world. Unfortunately, the Americans did win with, you know, the Northwest Hawaiian Chain Islands. So Australia's number 2. But anyhow, but hopefully the French will finish developing their plans, which butts up to this too. So it's good to see, you know, a lot of blue water protection starting to happen around the world. Other things we were doing with the reef sharks out there, you can see on the tail here, there's a little white thing that's basically a dive computer. Because you have the different species of sharks living there, we're trying to start to tease out what the niches are of the sharks by looking at activity patterns. And so because these had good success in approaching these animals and recapturing them under the water, we were able to deploy technology and then retrieve it. In fact, we have used these animals as test beds for a few different technologies that have been developed because we know we can get them back. And so we're able to look at the dive profiles of the species, like the white tip. That's a typical 24-hour track there. So the white tip, when you see them during the day, will be sitting on the sea floor, just buccal pumping. As soon as the sun sets, their behavior totally changes. And you can see how erratic their dive profile is while they're hunting. The white tip has an advantage over other species in that it can fold its dorsal fins down and actually squeeze into tight holes and crevices, and they're feeding predominantly on sleeping fish. And as soon as the sun comes up, they'll just go back and park themselves and rest during the day. This is a track over a couple of days. The interesting thing here is on the second day, in the middle, you can see there's a lot of activity of the shark around midday. So that was associated with a dive boat showing up. And so divers would hit the water. It's not that there was feeding taking place at this time, but divers would swim to the sharks to take photos and all that kind of stuff. But when we analysed the data, we actually showed that sharks, their behaviour would start to change about an hour before the dive boat moored and started dive activities. So the sharks were hearing the boat coming an hour away. You know, the boats out there are doing sort of 8 to 10 knots. So, you know, they can hear the boat about 10 nautical miles away. And so their behaviour would change accordingly. And so because with the white tip, it needs to rest during the day for its normal metabolism, this would have a negative effect on the shark. It'd be losing energy. And when they do shark feeds in that area, it's mainly the grey reefs and silver tips that get the food. The white tips are all in there, but they hardly get any food at all. So it does have a negative effect on the sharks, but is it a huge issue? Oh, that's just the graph to remind me to tell you how the behaviour changed. But long term, because there's no, you know, on average, when we do have tourism, there's only 1 or 2 boats out there for 1 or 2 days a week. So it's probably not, you know, significant to the sharks at the moment. But years ago, we used to have 5 boats a week out there. That dropped out after the first GFC. But it's just one of those things to be, you know, to be mindful of in the future if we do get increased activity out there. That, you know, looking at the effects on these sharks would have to be looked at. And we've gone on similarly now to do looking at the energetics of the bull sharks in Fiji and other places like that. So yeah, it's interesting stuff coming out at the moment, and also looking at changes in shark behaviour as a result of ecotourism. One of the big animals that everyone's interested in is the tiger. Historically, when we first started, all our work was in the far north of the Great Barrier Reef, out on the edge of the shelf at a place called Raine Island, which is the most significant island in all of Australia in terms of biology. It's Queensland's biggest seabird nesting site, and it's also the, turn that down, the biggest nesting site for green sea turtles in the world. On an average year, you can be getting a couple of thousand a night nesting. On a peak year, which I've luckily been up there twice in the last 25 years or so. I've seen over 20,000 turtles on the beach in one night, which is a big job when you're part of the team counting them. So these sea turtles come from far and wide, all over the Great Barrier Reef, New Guinea, even the South Pacific, coming back to this island to nest. It's also, there's a lot of information on Raine Island on the net, because the last 5 years has been a big program with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation to actually rebuild the island, because to lift the sand up about 0.5 metre, because we found that the eggs were drowning on the king high tide. So even though it's the most biologically significant island in Australia, the most highly protected, we have now had to physically go in and manipulate the island as part of, mitigating climate change issues and all that kind of stuff. It's a massive program, so yeah, it's worth a whole another talk by itself. Obviously, with that many turtles showing up, you get the predators, and so we did a lot of work on the tracking of the tigers to look at the home range. The most I've ever been in the water up there was 22 at a time, which gets pretty exciting. And the tigers, interestingly enough, are there not so much to feed on the living, but the dead. Because you have so many turtles nesting in that site, and it's in the far north, so it's really hot. If a female turtle isn't off the beach by, say, about 9 in the morning, they can literally cook and die on the beach. And those that die in the tide zone, as the tide comes up, the carcasses drift off, and then the tigers feed upon them. So we published a paper a few years ago showing that most of the provisioning of the tigers actually comes as a result of feeding upon these dead carcasses. And that's when you can get lots, up to 22 tigers, as I said, will be in there feeding on a turtle carcass. They're actually very polite with each other. The smaller ones always give way to the bigger ones. And this is footage of shopping in the water with them. They're a great shark to be in the water with for filming. You can get right in there amongst the action. Occasionally they'll turn around and think, what are you? But normally if you've got a big camera to bump them on the nose, they'll go back to the turtle for a feed. What you don't get from these videos and stuff like that is the stink of the dead turtle, and the turtle oil when you've been in the water with them just gets all over your body. It's really rank. So then we will tag the tigers. Again, we were trying to come up with techniques as benign as possible. So we use turtle tuna heads put together in what we call a tuna necklace, and we chuck that in. And because they've been feeding on turtles, the tigers are actually very responsive when you chuck some tuna in. And then basically we play the shark in and again grab it by the tail. In the early days, I used to jump in the water and tail rope them, but after the university saw what I was doing, there was a few HR issues. And so we had to come up with a safe technique, which is this. We call it the shark claw. It's like a handcuff that snaps over the tail of the shark so we can grab it. In the early days when we used hooks, it can take quite a while to play the shark in. But when you tail rope a tiger, they'll stop swimming in about 60 to 90 seconds. This is some footage of the shark claw in action. In this case, we had a turtle carcass drifting by with tigers on it. The claw technique also allows you to, if you want one particular shark, we've used that to recapture particular tagged animals. And so you just got to wait for the tail to get up into a vertical position, and then it just snaps on, which will be coming up momentarily. Here it goes on now. So it clicks on, comes off that pole. So again, it's like a handcuff going around the tail, and then we have it connected to a rope and a large fender buoy. The shark drags the fender, and that drag puts the tension on the shark, and it just stops swimming in about 60 to 90 seconds. So then we'll motor over to it, get it up to surface, put a second lasso rope on the tail. You've got to play it a little bit, because if there's too much tension, the shark claw can pop. That's why we don't tie it to the boat, the rope. We just let it play a bit, and then we can secure the shark on the side of the boat and do the tagging. And we use a range of different wildlife computer tags. This is an old model. The new models are a lot smaller now. and these are just bolted to the dorsal fin, and then off the shark goes. It's a saltwater switch. So when the shark hits the surface, then we can get a position fix on it. Thought it was going to run, but I'll show you some tracks soon because that animation is not working. The other thing we're doing out there is depth, and it's probably what you guys are a bit more interested in because you guys are into the deep. Is we did some tagging and critter cam work on some of the tigers out there. And what we found is that they'll go from the surface down to about 400 meters. And they'll do the sinusoidal swimming pattern about every 40 minutes when they're not swimming around in the shallows looking for turtles to feed upon. We're going back up this summer to do more, where we're going to put internal temperature tags and external temperature tags. But my shark research colleague, Adam Barnett, has been working and looking at the movements of tigers and temperatures and stuff like that. And it appears that they do have an optimum temperature that they want to be at for them, their normal metabolism. Remember, up in the far north during the peak of summer when the turtles are there, that the shallow waters around the reef can be 32 degrees Celsius. So it can be very, very warm for these animals. But they're able just to dive off the edge of the reef. Around Raine Island, it's about 500 to 800 meters deep. If you guys got a 3D track of that area, would be very excited. And so they can get down deep quick to get to that cooler water. But the other thing with sharks doing sinusoidal swimming patterns, you see it with great whites and things like that. As they're gliding down, that's when they're having a rest. So they'll just shut down and glide, then power up, and then go back down again. So the other thing we learned up there is that when you look through the old books and stuff like that, that tigers are a nocturnal shark. We found that the tigers around Raine are a tidal shark. So basically, as soon as that tide's starting to come up onto the reef and the island, as soon as they can get over the reef top, they'll be over it, like in waist deep water, and start swimming around the island, waiting to be there be the first animal there for any new carcasses to drift off the island as a result of the tide. That's to remind me to say using inflatable boats is not always good when it comes to tiger shark research. And right, what I want to do is going to jump onto our live site so we can look at so we've got two different tracking sites at the moment. Share screen. So reeftracks.org. So you can jump onto that. And so at the moment, these are all the sharks we've been tracking. And there's a few historical ones up there as well. So if we look at, say, Belinda, who's actually named after my fiance, and we've actually caught Belinda she's had 3 separate satellite tags on her. So this is down the Whitsundays. And this site, the interesting thing with it is you can animate the moves as it's temporally correct. So you can see what the residency time is around the different areas with that particular shark. But obviously after this incidences of sharks down there where we had 4 attacks in a period of 2 weeks, the local tourism industry were really wanting to know what species were there, where did the species go, were they resident, and all those kind of issues. So so you can see that Belinda, her last ping was the 1st of June. One of the, let's back out of that one. One of the other interesting tracks is Lisa, who was also tagged in the Whitsundays. And she's basically made a beeline across the Coral Sea up towards the Solomon Islands. So you can see she hung down after tagging for a few months. And again, these are only giving us data points when the shark comes to the dorsal fin, breaks the surface, and it breaks the surface long enough for us to get a lock on the animal. And you can see her tracking across there. So it's quite a large swim. So what we are seeing is that some tigers will have a kind of a home base. And interestingly, with the tracks, when you look at them up at Raine Island, that they'll go past the island even in winter, like every couple of weeks or so, like a GPS repositioning, and to reset it. Other ones we've been working on, we started satellite tagging whale sharks last year up in Wreck Bay, which is just to the south of Raine Island. So Wreck Bay is the first big cut in. We do get lots of really interesting upwellings occurring there, lots of plankton. And we have historically had reports of whale sharks in that area. And last year we mounted the first expedition where we had a spotter plane, and we did pop on a number of satellite tags onto the whale sharks, which were a clamp that went onto the dorsal fin. But unfortunately, the clamp system, it kind of would fall off after a few months. So we're fine-tuning that again for this season. So yeah, so that's basically some of the tracks of the sharks that are hanging out in the Coral Sea. And so yeah, up in the shallows a bit more from what where you guys have been looking at the moment. It has been interesting to see that a couple of deep water species. When we did do when I've been talking on the dives, we did see silver tips down to 350 meters when we did the Picasso BBC expedition. And we did have the bait cage bitten in half by something large, which possibly could be 6 gills, like had been previously spotted out with the land emissions that happened out there. But so far you've had the dogfish last week, and then that other species. Well, you've had 2 other species actually. One looks, I wouldn't want to say it, but need to have a look at the 4K vision, but geez, it looks very similar to a cookie cutter type shark. So yeah, it's all pretty exciting. So yeah, so again, it's awesome you guys are out there doing all this. It's data we've never had before. It's the best opportunity, and as just one of the researchers that's been following everything, it's just mind-blowing watching everything. So I thank you and the Smith Ocean Foundation very much for coming to our part of the world and doing such valuable science. So thank you guys.